Dawn rose slowly over the airfields of southern Italy, casting a thin red line across rows of P-51 Mustangs waiting on metal mats still wet with night frost. Mechanics moved like silhouettes, tightening panels and checking fuel lines as the engines coughed awake one by one. The men who would fly them stood in silence beside their aircraft, adjusting gloves, clearing visors, preparing themselves for another mission that would take them deep into a sky filled with flak and fighters. They were the only black fighter group in the United States Army Air Forces, trained at Tuskegee, doubted by their commanders, dismissed by critics who insisted they would never be capable of matching white pilots in combat. Yet every morning they walked toward their aircraft with the same quiet discipline, knowing that the bombers they escorted depended on them to survive the long route into enemy territory. For these men, the war was fought on two fronts, one against an enemy with wings marked by black crosses, and another against a country that questioned their worth even as it demanded their courage. But when their red-tailed fighters lifted into the cold air, the record they built would silence doubts for generations. Low clouds drifted over the Adriatic as crews gathered for the morning briefing inside a dim, canvas-walled tent at Ramitelli Airfield. The scent of oil, dust, and damp canvas clung to the air. Maps were pinned to wooden boards, marked with the blue arcs of bomber routes and the red lines of likely interception points. The men who filled the benches wore the same uniforms as every other pilot in the 15th Air Force, but the path that had brought them here was unlike any other. Their journey began years before the war reached these shores, in classrooms and cockpits across Alabama, at a time when segregation shaped every aspect of their training. Tuskegee Institute had been chosen as the experiment center, not because the nation believed in the abilities of black pilots, but because it sought to contain them. Critics insisted that African Americans lacked the discipline, intelligence, and technical skill required for aviation. Newspapers echoed those doubts. Military leaders repeated them. Yet each step of the training program challenged those myths. Cadets studied navigation, aerodynamics, engine mechanics, and gunnery with a level of academic rigor that rivaled any flight school in the country. Instructors pushed them through drills in biplanes and monoplanes, demanding precision and discipline under pressure. Graduation offered no guarantees. Even as pilots earned their wings, many commanders refused to place them in combat. The 99th Pursuit Squadron waited months for meaningful deployment. Letters circulated through Washington questioning the value of the program. Reports undermined their performance before they ever faced an enemy fighter. But the men continued to train, logging hours in cockpit and classroom, determined to master every skill the war would demand. By the time the first group reached North Africa in 1943, they carried not only the weight of their own survival, but the burden of proof for an entire generation. On the flight line in Italy, those early struggles remained an unspoken memory. Engines roared outside the briefing tent as officers outlined the day's assignment. High-altitude bomber streams needed protection on a long haul over the Alps, toward targets deep inside Germany. Intelligence expected heavy resistance. Luftwaffe fighters still held considerable strength in the region, and flak batteries along the mountain passes were known to track formations with deadly precision. The task of escorting heavy bombers was unforgiving. A moment's hesitation, a few seconds of missed altitude or spacing, and the formations could be torn apart. Yet the pilots who listened remained calm, taking notes, adjusting flight plans, absorbing the mission with steady focus. For them, every successful escort was more than another step toward victory. It was evidence, recorded, measured, undeniable, that skill and courage belonged to no single race. Snow lingered in the shadows of the Apennines as the red-tailed fighters rose in tight formation, their exhaust tracing pale lines across the morning sky. Below them, convoys moved slowly along winding roads, carrying fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts toward the front. The war stretched across continents, but for the men in the cockpits, the world narrowed to a few instruments, a canopy of glass, and the distant glint of bomber wings waiting for their protection. They slid into escort position with practiced precision, matching speed and altitude until the heavies settled into a steady rhythm. Inside the bomber fuselages, crews watched the red tails appear off their flanks with a sense of relief that grew mission by mission. Word had spread across the 15th Air Force. These pilots held formation. They did not chase enemy fighters into long, reckless dives. They stayed with the bombers until the final turn home. Discipline had become their signature. Far above the alpine snowfields, the first black bursts of flak marked the Luftwaffe's welcome. The bombers tightened their formations. The escorts adjusted position, weaving through the shudder of turbulence as explosions blossomed around them. Metal fragments whistled past canopies. The sky filled with smoke and static, a world of sudden impacts and brief sparks of light. Pilots gripped their controls, eyes scanning for fighters that could emerge at any moment through the drifting haze. Training took over, guiding every movement. Throttle corrections, altitude changes, coordinated turns. Years of preparation in Alabama and North Africa converged in these seconds of controlled chaos. The discipline that commanders once dismissed now revealed its strength. Spacing held. Formations remained intact. No one broke ranks in search of personal victory. The mission was the priority, and the men who flew here understood the cost of failure. They knew that bomber crews counted on them not simply for tactical advantage, but for survival. The gravity of that responsibility anchored every decision. In the cold air at 20,000 feet, hesitation could kill, but recklessness could do the same. When the first German fighters appeared, they came fast, diving out of the sun in disciplined waves. Engines screamed as they broke through the bomber formation, seeking vulnerable gaps. But each wave met an immediate, coordinated response. Red-tailed Mustangs rolled into pursuit, cutting across the angles of attack, forcing enemy aircraft to break away before they could find a target. The fight stretched across miles of open sky, a shifting geometry of speed and instinct. Every second demanded clarity of judgment, every maneuver a measured balance between protection and aggression. The bombers continued their long advance toward the target, their escorts holding firm on either side. Through radio calls and brief flashes of tracer fire, the battle unfolded with a precision that defied the doubts once written into reports in Washington. The men who had been expected to fail were now defining success for an entire command. And as the formations pushed deeper into enemy territory, the sky bore witness to what discipline, training, and unwavering purpose could achieve under fire. Winds swept over the upper Danube as the formations pressed east, the sunlight breaking through thin veils of cloud and flashing across the silver skins of the bombers. The escorts adjusted to every change with an ease born from relentless practice. Their movements smooth, almost choreographed. But beneath the disciplined exterior lay experiences shaped by years of isolation, prejudice, and constant scrutiny. Every pilot who guided a red-tailed Mustang through the sky carried the memory of hurdles placed before him long before meeting the enemy in combat. They remembered being told that black men lacked the temperament for flying, that they were unfit for technical responsibility, that their presence in the Air Corps was an experiment destined to fail. Even in the war zones of North Africa and Italy, they navigated segregated bases, separate facilities, and officers who questioned their competence before learning their names. Yet the air was the one place where perception yielded to performance. Up here, only precision mattered. Every course correction, every defensive turn, every moment of restraint or aggression left a record more enduring than prejudice. Reports filed by bomber crews praised their steady presence. Mission logs began to note the absence of losses under their guard. The shift was gradual, but unmistakable. Confidence spread among those who depended on them most directly. The men flying the heavy bombers, who faced waves of enemy fire on every mission. When they spotted red tails off their wings, they understood that their chances of returning home had just increased. On the ground, however, change came slowly. Some commanders acknowledged their effectiveness only reluctantly. Others insisted that any success resulted from missions of lesser difficulty, ignoring the reality that these pilots consistently flew some of the longest and most dangerous escort routes in the theater. Reports circulated praising their discipline. Yet the men themselves still encountered barriers that reminded them that combat skill alone could not erase the boundaries set by segregation. Dining halls and recreation centers remained divided. Promotions came more slowly. The war effort depended on their ability, but institutions resisted the implications of their achievements. Still, the squadron forged its identity from the pressure. They focused on the mission, refining tactics that emphasized teamwork, measured aggression, and unwavering adherence to their escort role. In a war where many fighter groups were tempted to chase personal victories, these pilots defined success by how many bombers returned home. It required suppressing impulses that had shaped fighter culture since the earliest days of air combat. It demanded patience in the face of danger, discipline under attack, and an understanding that the long arc of the mission mattered more than moments of individual glory. The respect they earned from bomber crews was built on that consistency, one mission at a time, across routes stretching from Romania to Austria and deep into Germany. Above the clouds, the rhythm of the formation settled again as the bombers approached another flak zone. The escorts tightened their positions, engines humming steadily. For the men flying here, the war was not only a chance to defend their nation, it was an opportunity to redefine how that nation measured courage and capability. Every mile flown, every bomber saved, chipped away at assumptions once presented as fact. And as the sky darkened with the smoke of distant defenses, the resolve of the red-tailed pilots remained unshaken. The cold air thinned as the formations crossed into a region marked on intelligence maps as one of the most heavily defended industrial corridors in Central Europe. Below them, rail yards, factories, and fuel depots stretched in long geometric patterns. Even before the first flak batteries opened fire, the crews felt the shift in atmosphere. The sky carried a tension that years of experience had taught them to recognize. The red tails adjusted spacing once more, preparing for the storm that almost always followed. The first explosions rose in layered waves, dark blossoms expanding across the altitude band the bombers were forced to maintain. The escorts dipped slightly, weaving through the bursts in a pattern refined through countless missions. Every movement balanced protection with self-preservation. Too wide a turn, and a gap opened for enemy fighters to exploit. Too shallow, and the shockwave of a near hit could shear, control surfaces, or crack a wing root. It was a domain where precision mattered more than bravado. And the men who flew here had learned to measure every risk against the needs of the formation. Through the turbulence, shadows appeared on the horizon, tight groups of German fighters climbing to intercept. Their engines left thin trails of vapor as they ascended with practiced coordination. Even depleted, the Luftwaffe remained a formidable opponent, its pilots seasoned by years of war. its tactics refined by constant adaptation. The attack unfolded quickly. Enemy fighters cut across the bomber stream, seeking to fracture the formation, to isolate stragglers, to overwhelm the escorts with rapid, repeated strikes. The red-tailed Mustangs countered with movement that reflected both training and instinct. They intercepted the first wave head-on, forcing the attackers to break formation before they could align their shots. Radio man chatter crackled with terse, clipped calls, altitude adjustments, positions, vectors. Each pilot relied on the others to close gaps, to anticipate turns, to shield bombers without drifting too far from the protective ring they had built around the formation. Their strategy emphasized denial rather than destruction. Every German fighter pushed off target was a success, whether or not it went down in flames. High above the rooftops and smokestacks, the escorts matched the enemy's aggression with restraint that reflected the mission's purpose. They did not chase fleeing aircraft into unpredictable dives. They did not abandon their stations for the sake of confirming a kill. They stayed close, maintaining the formation's integrity even when bursts of tracer fire streaked through their ranks. It was a style of combat that frustrated adversaries who relied on disruption and chaos. The calm, deliberate defense of the bombers denied them the openings they needed. But the pressure was constant. With each new wave of attackers, the risk multiplied. A single miscalculation could send a fighter spiraling into the bomber stream. A moment of hesitation could leave a gap wide enough for an enemy to slip through. Yet the men in the cockpits continued their work with steady precision, guided not by recognition or reward, but by the unspoken agreement that the crews behind them depended on their discipline to survive. Up here, the contradictions of the world below lost much of their weight. Segregated barracks, restrictive regulations, and the daily reminders of a country still divided by race all faded beneath the immediacy of combat. What endured was purpose. Each mission reinforced the reality that skill and commitment were not defined by the boundaries set on the ground. And as the cloud of flak thickened around the bombers and the distant rumble of detonations echoed across the sky, the red-tailed pilots continued to carve their legacy through the choices they made under fire. The sky tightened into a maze of smoke and contrails as the formations neared the heart of the target zone. Below, the factories and rail junctions that fed the German war machine stood clustered around rivers and rail lines, their chimneys marking the landscape like steel towers. The bombers prepared for the final approach, opening their bays, aligning for the long, steady run that would leave them most vulnerable. Every escort pilot understood what this moment demanded. The enemy did too. The next attack came with a ferocity unmatched by the earlier waves. German fighters dove in from multiple altitudes, attempting to split the formation from above and below. Their wings flashed through the haze as they fired, banking hard and climbing away before the Mustangs could fully counter. For an instant, the sky seemed to contract, filled with the overlapping arcs of gunfire and the thunder of near hits. The red tails responded with a precision born of shared instinct. They tightened their ring around the bombers, intercepting attackers at the edges, driving them off course before they could press their advantage. Every second carried a sense of urgency that went beyond the normal chaos of air combat. The bombers had to maintain a straight path for accuracy, and that path exposed them to predictable lines of attack. The escorts flew in closer than usual, closing the distance until some pilots could see the faces of the men firing from enemy cockpits. In the blur of motion, the distinction between calm discipline and desperate necessity narrowed. Control mattered more than ever, but so did the willingness to push into danger to block a threat. On one flank, a cluster of enemy fighters broke through the outer screen, angling toward the lead bomber elements. The red tails moved instantly, rolling into a sharp turn that pulled them into the attacker's path. Tracer rounds streaked past their wings as they forced the Germans to change their approach. The dogfight compressed into a few hundred yards of space, a violent orbit of speed and geometry. One Mustang dove beneath an enemy fighter, cutting off its line of fire, while another climbed to intercept the aircraft, attempting to swoop in behind. Each maneuver demanded total focus, total precision. The goal was not to score kills. It was to deny the enemy a clean shot at the bombers. Flak thickened around them, adding another layer of danger to every turn. Black bursts flashed close enough to jolt cockpits, rattling controls and showering wings with fragments. Through the haze, the bombers continued their run, their engines droning with the steady rhythm of inevitability. The escorts matched their speed, matching their vulnerability. No one broke formation, even as the sky vibrated with the force of explosions. In those minutes above the target, the contradictions that shaped the lives of these pilots sharpened into a stark clarity. They fought for a nation that segregated them, doubted them, and questioned their right to serve. Yet here, this narrow corridor of fire, they were the barrier between hundreds of airmen and the fate that awaited them without protection. Responsibility transcended the injustice they carried with them from their training fields in Alabama and the divided bases of Italy. The final wave of fighters appeared as the bombers released their payloads. It was a last attempt to exploit the moment of vulnerability that followed the drop. The red tails surged forward again, intercepting the attackers before they could close the distance. Metal flashed as aircraft crossed paths, engines straining under the force of sudden maneuvers. A Mustang rolled into a defensive dive to protect a bomber drifting out of position, while another climbed to block a high-angle assault. Their movements were fluid, urgent, deliberate. The enemy pressed hard, but the escorts pressed harder, holding the line until the bombers began their turn away from the target. As the formation shifted onto its homeward path, the intensity of the attack finally began to fade. The flak diminished, the last enemy fighters turned back toward their own airfields, and the sky opened again into the pale expanse of afternoon light. The bombers tightened their formation, counting their engines, checking their wings, assessing their damage. In the cockpits of the red-tailed Mustangs, the pilots steadied their breathing, scanned their instruments, and prepared for the long flight home. They had held. They had protected. Not a single bomber was lost. The wind shifted across the returning formation as it crossed back over the mountains, the jagged silhouettes of the Alps emerging through thin layers of cloud. The bombers flew lower now, engines strained from the long run, fuselages patched with flak holes that caught the light in brief, uneven flashes. Inside their cockpits, pilots and gunners scanned the sky with attention that did not ease, simply because the target was behind them. Returning home was often as dangerous as reaching the objective. Damage accumulated in ways no one could predict. Engines overheated. Fuel leaks worsened. A single straggler could draw enemy fighters that still lurked along the retreat routes. The red-tailed Mustangs tightened their escort positions again, adjusting altitude to match the bombers that were losing speed. One aircraft dipped slightly, its engine coughing as smoke trailed behind it. The escorts shifted in response, forming a small protective arc around the damaged plane. It was an instinctive maneuver, practiced but never taken for granted. Protecting the vulnerable mattered as much as shielding the strongest elements of the formation. The fighters remained alert, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Even with the enemy seemingly dispersed, no one assumed safety. Combat had taught them that danger often returned in brief, violent bursts when vigilance waned. The descent through the Alpine passes carried its own set of risks. Updrafts tossed the aircraft, shaking, wings already stressed from the flak fields. Clouds gathered along the peaks, obscuring visibility and threatening to scatter the formation. The red tails flew slightly above the bombers now, guiding them through the turbulent corridors, adjusting course as needed to maintain cohesion. Their presence offered more than tactical protection. It anchored the formation psychologically, signaling that no aircraft, damaged or not, would be left to navigate the journey alone. In the long silence of transit, memories of training rose unbidden. They remembered the long, hot days in Alabama, running drills under the watchful eyes of instructors who knew the stakes of failure. They remembered classrooms where every mistake was magnified by the scrutiny of those waiting for proof that the program would not succeed. They remembered the pressure to excel, not merely for themselves, but for everyone who would follow. Those memories stayed with them now, carried across thousands of miles of sky. The discipline forged in those early years shaped every choice they made on missions like this one. As the formation cleared the mountains, the terrain softened into rolling fields and patchwork farmland. The air warmed. The haze thinned. The tension remained. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. Ammunition belts lay nearly empty. Yet the aircraft continued forward in steady rhythm, a testament to the coordination that had guided them through the most dangerous hours of the day. The damaged bomber still struggled at the rear, but the escort around it remained firm, protecting it as the distance home narrowed. Only when the Adriatic coast appeared in a faint blue line along the horizon did the pressure inside the cockpits begin to ease. The bombers tightened their formation one final time, preparing for the descent toward their airfields. The Mustangs held their positions until the last possible moment, scanning the sky to ensure no late attacker would strike at the returning crews. When they finally broke off to begin their own landing approach, the separation felt both routine and profound. They had completed another mission. They had brought their charges home. Touchdown came with a familiar jolt of wheels hitting metal runway mats. Engines sputtered down, props slowing as ground crews rushed forward. Mechanics signaled damage assessments. Medics checked on crews shaken by the long exposure to flak. Officers recorded aircraft numbers, positions, and times. Each detail became part of the growing record that defined the group's performance. And amid the noise and movement of the flight line, the red-tailed pilots climbed from their cockpits, exhausted yet steady, knowing that what they achieved in the sky would speak louder than any report written before they ever deployed. Word traveled quickly across the base. The bombers had returned without a single loss. The record held. The streak continued. But for the men who had flown the mission, the significance lay not in the numbers alone, but in what those numbers represented. Proof carved into the fabric of war, undeniable even to those who resisted its implications. They had done what they were trained to do. They had done what they were told they could not. The sun lowered behind the hangars, casting long shadows across the airfield as the pilots walked back toward their tents. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the quiet hum of evening. The day's mission had tested them again, pressed them again, demanded of them again the precision and restraint that defined their role. And once more, they had answered with the same resolve that carried them from Tuskegee's runways to the skies of Europe. They knew another mission would come, another target, another stretch of contested sky. But as night settled over the base, their confidence remained grounded in the reality they had built. That their skill, their discipline, and their commitment had reshaped the expectations placed upon them. And in a war where recognition was uneven and respect too often reluctant, they had crafted a legacy that no prejudice could erase. The morning after the mission, the airfield stirred slowly under a pale wash of sunlight. Mechanics walked the lines of parked bombers, counting flak holes, marking damaged panels with chalk, running hands along scorched metal where rounds had struck within inches of fuel tanks. Near the Mustangs, ground crews inspected wings and control surfaces, checking for stress fractures hidden beneath layers of paint. The work was routine, but the conversations carried a different tone now. Crews spoke of the Escort with a steadiness that reflected trust earned mission by mission. The Red Tails had held the line again, and the men whose survival depended on them did not take that lightly. Inside briefing rooms across the 15th Air Force, officers compiled the day's reports. Flight paths were traced. Ammunition expended was tallied. Enemy contacts were logged. And in a category that mattered as much as any statistic on aircraft production or enemy losses, the number of bombers returning from the mission stood unchanged. Not one had been lost to enemy fighters. The record, once dismissed by skeptics as coincidence or incomplete data, now formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. The discipline of the escorts, the precision of their formations, and their unwavering commitment to remain with the bombers were quietly reshaping the expectations of commanders who had never believed they would see such performance from this unit. Yet even as their reputation strengthened along the front, the men who flew the red-tailed Mustangs returned each day to a base that reminded them of the divisions they carried into the war. Their dining halls remained separate. Their barracks stood apart. Their achievements in the sky did not dissolve the policies that limited their roles on the ground. But the contrast only sharpened their resolve. They understood that every successful escort, every bomber protected, every mission completed without loss, added weight to a legacy no regulation could diminish. Word of their effectiveness traveled beyond Italy. Bomber crews requested them by name, noting in mission debriefs that the presence of the Red Tails reduced their anxiety before takeoff. Commanders in strategic planning rooms began assigning them to some of the most critical and dangerous routes, trusting their reliability even when they hesitated to acknowledge the larger implications of their success. The men who had once been labeled an experiment were now an asset too valuable to overlook. Despite the growing respect from those who needed their protection, challenges persisted. Promotions came slowly. Recognition in official channels lagged behind the reality of their combat record. Reports documenting their performance often circulated quietly, overshadowed by narratives that favored more established groups. But the pilots who walked the dusty paths between the tents at Ramatelli understood that the record written in the sky carried more permanence than the words stamped onto administrative files. The truth of what they accomplished could not be erased by silence. As winter shifted toward spring, the missions continued. Oil refineries in Austria, rail networks in southern Germany, industrial districts near the Danube. Each target required the same discipline, the same patience, the same willingness to fly into a sky where the danger came layered in fire and metal. The Red Tails carried with them not only their training, but the cumulative weight of every mission flown before. They knew the scrutiny that followed them. They knew the stakes. And still, day after day, they climbed into their Mustangs, lifted into the cold morning air. The impact of their service began to ripple outward in small ways. Letters home from bomber crews mentioned them with gratitude. Rumors spread along the ranks about the escort group that lost no bombers. Some commanders began to speak of their performance with a tone that suggested not surprise, but respect. And though prejudice did not vanish and equality remained distant, their consistency forced a reevaluation of assumptions once considered unshakable. On the ground, evenings offered brief respite. Pilots gathered near their tents, discussing maneuvers, reviewing tactics, sharing the quiet companionship forged through shared danger. They rarely spoke of the broader contradictions of the war, but the awareness remained, woven into every interaction, every mission, every moment spent preparing for the next flight. The knowledge that they fought for a country that did not grant them full equality was not a burden they carried lightly. Yet it did not weaken their resolve. Instead, it fueled a commitment to excellence that transcended individual recognition. When night settled over Ramitelli, the engines quieted and the lights inside the briefing tents dimmed. The base lay wrapped in a stillness broken only by distant waves along the coast. The pilots rested knowing that another dawn would bring another mission, another opportunity to guard the skies, another chance to prove again what they had already demonstrated countless times. And slowly, across the vast machinery of the war effort, their legacy grew, quietly, steadily, undeniably. Spring brought clearer skies to the Adriatic coast, but the clarity only revealed the scale of the work still ahead. The war in Europe was entering its final, violent months. German defenses remained dangerous, their fighter units desperate, but far from defeated. Every mission demanded the same vigilance, and every escort required the same precision that had already defined the Red Tails' record. Yet for all the familiarity of the routine, the atmosphere on the base had begun to shift. What had once felt like an experiment now carried the weight of proven necessity. Commanders visiting Ramitelli no longer arrived with the narrow expectations that had shadowed earlier months. Instead, they studied mission logs with a seriousness that reflected the undeniable value of the group's service. Pilots who had once been excluded from key briefings were now invited to contribute insights on tactics and formation adjustments. Though segregation remained intact, recognition, measured, cautious, but real, was seeping into the layers of a system not built to accommodate it. The men who walked between the rows of tents understood that institutional change was slow, but they also recognized that the sky had given them a platform no official document could easily deny. Beyond the airfield, the growing reputation of the Red Tails reached units scattered across Europe. Bomber crews shared stories with newcomers, tales of long missions, where the red-tailed Mustang stayed close even when fuel ran low. Accounts of disciplined escorts that held formation while other groups chased enemy fighters into dangerous dives. Quiet acknowledgments that when the Red Tails flew beside them, survival felt more attainable. These stories spread faster than official praise, carried through mess halls, briefing rooms, and transport planes moving from front to front. Recognition at this level was not ceremonial. It was practical, born from the lived experience of men who owed their lives to the discipline of the escorts. On the ground, however, the pilots remained anchored in the reality that their success did not shield them from the inequalities woven into military life. Recreational facilities remained divided. Assignments outside of flying roles were still restricted. Notices posted on bulletin boards reminded them of regulations crafted in an era that refused to acknowledge their achievements. They lived with the duality, admired for their combat skill, yet constrained by policies that had shaped their lives long before they reached Italy. But the contrast never weakened their collective identity. Instead, it forged a unity rooted not only in shared purpose, but in shared struggle. They reviewed mission footage together, refining tactics with an analytical clarity that reflected both ambition and necessity. They supported new pilots cycling into the squadron, teaching them the rhythm of escort discipline and the importance of holding the line even when instincts urged otherwise. Mentorship became a quiet thread connecting one group of airmen to the next, ensuring that success was not a moment, but a legacy. As the war's final campaigns intensified, missions grew longer, pushing deeper into territory where German defenses, though weakened, remained capable of sudden violence. Each new target brought with it the familiar mix of flak bursts, fighter engagements, and the endless balancing act between aggression and restraint. The Red Tails continued to protect the bomber formations with the same unwavering precision that had defined their earliest missions. Even as exhaustion accumulated and the lure of home loomed closer, they maintained the discipline that had become their hallmark. When victory in Europe finally approached, the shift was felt more in the rhythm of operations than in any single announcement. Missions shortened, enemy fighters appeared less frequently. Flak batteries, once fierce and coordinated, now offered sporadic resistance. The long arcs of danger that had defined the war began to narrow. And through that narrowing corridor, the Red Tails continued to fly, escorting the bombers until the final missions were completed. As the skies quieted, the significance of their record settled into the consciousness of the men who had fought beside them. The bomber crews, the commanders, the strategists, all understood that the discipline of the red-tailed escorts had saved countless lives. It reshaped expectations within the Air Force. It challenged assumptions coded into decades of segregation. And it offered a glimpse of what the nation might become if it chose to recognize fully the courage of those who had served it so faithfully. When the guns finally fell silent, the pilots of the red-tailed Mustangs prepared to return home. Their aircraft, worn by months of missions, lined the airfield in rows that spoke to the endurance of both machine and man. The war's end brought relief, but it also carried an uncertainty that lay beyond the boundaries of the airfield. They would leave behind a theater where performance had earned them respect, even admiration, and return to a country still wrestling with the very prejudices they had disproved in combat. Yet as the last missions faded into memory and the Adriatic winds swept across the quieted base, one truth remained unmistakable. The legacy of the Red Tails had been written not in proclamations or ceremonies, but in thousands of miles flown beside bomber formations, in the lives they had protected, and in the record that stood unbroken by the time the war drew to a close. Their service had expanded the horizon of what the nation believed possible. The sun dipped low over Tuskegee, Alabama, years after the war, casting long shadows across familiar runways. The men who had flown the red-tailed Mustangs were scattered now, some in distant cities, some returning to small towns that had never fully welcomed them. Yet the record they forged remained intact, inscribed not on monuments, but in mission logs, survivor accounts, and the countless lives they had saved. They had proven that courage, skill, and discipline were not bound by race, that excellence demanded recognition on merit alone. In the skies of Europe, they had flown for a country that questioned their worth, and in doing so, they had redefined what it meant to serve. Their legacy endured in every bomber that returned safely, in every new pilot trained to follow their example, and in the slowly shifting perceptions of a nation forced to confront its own contradictions. Theirs was a victory measured not only in missions completed, but in barriers broken, assumptions challenged, and the quiet, undeniable truth that ability cannot be dictated by prejudice. Even decades later, the Red Tails remained a symbol of resilience, discipline, and the unyielding pursuit of justice in the most perilous of skies.